As I said, welcome. My name is Enda, and I'm a program director at the William J. Clinton Leadership Institute, which is part of the management school at Queen's University in Belfast. The aim of the Leadership Institute is to empower and develop leaders and future generations of leadership to create positive social and economic impact for a better world. So with that lens, we're delighted to have Serge Stroobants, the Director of Europe and the MENA region from the Institute of Economics and Peace, with us again today to talk about the findings of this year's Global Peace Index. And following Serge, we're going to have Dr. Andrew Thomson, who's going to talk about the potential for a Northern Ireland Peace Index and the connections to a positive peace in this part of the world. Andrew is a senior lecturer with the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice here at Queen's University, who along with Professor Hastings Dunnan has been a partner organisation with us since the start of a relationship with the IEP. And after Andrew, I'm going to try and maybe tie things together a little bit, and we're going to open the floor to a question and answer section, folks, for the remainder of our time. We in our institutes and the university, we've been delighted to be working with the Institute for Economics and Peace now for several years. And I know some of you on the call were on the webinar last year for the launch, and certain times we've been in Riddle Hall and things like that for the last few years. So we're absolutely delighted to have them with us again to really go into depth on the results of what is the 14th edition of this Global Peace Index. So folks, sit back. We're delighted to have Serge with us today, as I said, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end, and everything will be available, as I've said, on YouTube after. Thanks very much, folks. Welcome, and over to you, Serge.
Thank you very much, Enda, for your kind introduction and for organizing a launch event again with us this year out of Belfast, and as you have requested, and as we could see, out of so many places throughout the world. So thank you very much to the audience also for joining us today. And I'm going to share my screen and use a PowerPoint to present to you the key findings, but also the key trends of the Global Peace Index 2021. So the Institute for Economics and Peace, first of all, we are an independent, not-for-profit think tank. We look at the key drivers of peace, but also what we try to do is identify the economic benefits that an increased peacefulness can deliver. And next to these economic benefits, we also see that people really investing in positive peace, and thank you, Andrew, for talking about this, people investing in positive peace will be more happy, will be more developed, and we'll see their societies have higher scores, ESG scores, but also develop a higher ecological resilience. So the Institute for Economics and Peace is a think tank based in Sydney, Australia. This is where the research is done and where the head office is located. We have representations throughout the world, in the Americas, New York, close to the UN, connected to Mexico City. Why Mexico City? Influence in Central, Latin, and Southern America, but definitely also the motor of our largest national peace index, the Mexico Peace Index, which for the last 8 years have ranked the 32 Mexican states according to the levels of peace. I would say in the center of this world map, Brussels and The Hague, 2 locations in Europe, responsible for Europe and the MENA regions, and Harare in Zimbabwe, responsible for sub-Saharan Africa. So what we do is a lot of consultancy and research for large international organizations, multilateral organizations, governments, doing a lot of work on the economic impact of peace, on the interconnection between different strategic factors influencing peace and security, and the level of resilience of society to cope with those external shocks and impacts. We connect a lot with, of course, general audience like we do today, but also with policymakers and decision makers, but also with the academic environment. So we see a lot of our research reference in many books, a lot of university courses, and it's really a pleasure again today to collaborate with you guys at Queen's University in Belfast. So this is the 15th edition already, Enda, of the Global Peace Index. So, you know, we created the Global Peace Index. After that, we created the Institute for Economics and Peace, and then we continued on this, I would say, on this very early spirit of the Global Peace Index. So we rank about 163 countries. So it's pretty close to 100% of the world population. We use 23 different indicators. We developed this ourselves, and it's overseen by a panel of international experts. So our 23 indicators can be distributed over 3 different domains. First of all, we are measuring ongoing domestic and international conflict. Second domain would be internal societal safety and security. And third domain would be levels of militarization, in which there is one positive indicator, and that's the investments made in UN peacekeeping missions. So on our website, visionofhumanity.org, you can access all the research, all the data, really everything, every resource that we produce is put in open source online on our website. You can also access an interactive map like this one. And the color code is already giving you a first impression of the results of this year. But you can also click on each and every country on the map and access to the data, access per indicator, per domain of indicator for the full index, and really enjoy the in-depth the results of this year. So this year we had a slight decrease in peacefulness, only 0.7%, which is the second smallest decrease in peacefulness for the Global Peace Index, but it's the 9th deterioration in the last 13 years. The 4th deterioration in the past 5 years. And as you can see, more countries improved than deteriorated. This is also showing you that even with more countries improving, we still can have a decrease, because you can only increase difficultly, and with really bit by bit, you can increase your levels of peace, but it's quite easy to fall into the violence trap and fall into a stark or a very strong decrease of peace. And that's really what we are seeing when countries improving would do that by 0.1, 0.2, 0.5, maybe 1%. But when you decrease, sometimes 2 digits, or 10, 12, 15% decreases in peacefulness. So the improvements were mainly related to conflict, and also the impact of terrorism decreased. So in our global terrorism index last year, we noticed that we had a 6th consecutive year of decrease of the impact of peacefulness. Over these 6 years, almost 60% less impact today than we had at the peak of the impact of terrorism, and also the peak of larger international organizations around 2015, around 2015. So the deteriorations primarily driven by, I would say, the entire domain in militarization, but also in internal safety and security. And those are quite trend breakers, so changes in trend, and I'm going to elaborate on later in my presentation. So on the indicators with the largest deteriorations in this year Global Peace Index, violent demonstrations, so 3 times more countries falling than improving. Political instability, and it's almost linked, twice as many countries falling compared to those improving. And level of militarization with 97 countries, that's almost 60% of the Global Peace Index, deteriorating on the family of domain of indicators linked to militarization. So that's a clear change of trend. Over the past decade, we have seen a permanent decrease in the level of militarization, with 104 countries in the past decade having lower investments in the military. And in the past year, 1 year and a half, up to 2 years, this trend changed completely. And now we see more and more investments into the military and the development of the military in numbers, but also in capacities. The positive indicators, definitely conflict, lower number of conflict, lower number of casualties, and also less intense. Mostly driven by some of the conflicts in the MENA region, especially in the Middle East, entering a new phase, another phase in the conflict. And as I said, death from terrorism, 6th consecutive year improvement. So the highlights: Iceland is still the most peaceful country in the world. We had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to also organize a launch event over there, sponsored by the Prime Minister of Iceland. And what really struck me there when we started to collaborate with them, and of course we were congratulating them for being #1 since 2008 on the index. They said, well, that's nice, but there's still so much work to do, because we still, even if we are #1, we still need to become more peaceful. We still need to have an internal look at our society and clearly change some things. So if the first country on the index, the most peaceful country in the world, can have this attitude, I think this is a perfect example for all other 162 countries on the index. Ukraine and Iraq had the largest improvements. Well, we are talking about improvement. I'm not telling you that those countries are peaceful now, but they are more peaceful than they were last year, and really with a big change, a big positive change. So that's super. For example, Iraq is still in the bottom 5 of the Global Peace Index. The MENA region had the largest regional improvement. As I said, new phases for some or most of the conflicts in this region. So that's super positive, but it's still the least peaceful region of the world. And it's still a neighboring region for Europe. that remains the most peaceful region of the world. So we have the most and the least peaceful regions really neighboring each other. But we saw in Europe deterioration in political instability and, as I said, improvement in the impact of terrorism. So the negative approach is Afghanistan, 4 consecutive years, the world's least peaceful nation. However, this year we saw an increase in peacefulness, a very small increase in peacefulness. So maybe positive signs over there. The largest deteriorations, Burkina Faso and Belarus. So Belarus clearly, after the elections last year and violent demonstrations and repression of the popular movement, Burkina Faso, a next victim to jihadism and I would say extremism in this part of Africa. We saw the largest deteriorations, regional deteriorations for North America. So basically you can translate it into the USA. Only 2 countries in this region. Canada is still in the top 10 of the global peace index. So clearly violent demonstrations, high numbers, mostly driven by COVID protests, but also the political instability and definitely also some social movements like Black Lives Matter. We have seen that 6 of the 9 GPR regions deteriorated last year and only 3 improved. The most peaceful countries. First time that we have 8 countries in the top 10 located into the European zone, so that is clearly positive. Still New Zealand and Canada being there. Last year, number 8 was Singapore, dropped to number 11, mostly driven by larger investment into the military. The bottom 10 most peaceful countries, or least peaceful countries, I would say, this would be 9 out of 10 directly involved in a conflict on their soil and troubles and destabilization. But a positive note is that in the bottom 5, 4 countries increased the levels of peacefulness last year. Only Yemen continued to drop. So positive evolution there that clearly also generate the start of a change in trend, hopefully a change in trend. So as I said, North America, the largest deterioration, and the 3 only regions improve in the levels of peacefulness. Europe, but still political instability. MENA region, new faces into the conflict. And South Asia, clearly driven by this increase in peacefulness in Afghanistan. And then let's hope that this will continue for this country, sorry. So the 5 most countries that improved the most. So Ukraine, I spoke about it, Poland, North Macedonia, Iraq, and Vietnam. Poland, mostly driven by a very, very low perception of violence or the fear of violence. We produced this year with the Global Peace Index, and we will have a full report on this in September. This is a collaboration with the Lloyds Foundation in London, and we looked at the perception of fear throughout the world, and really Poland came very, very well placed there with very low levels of perception of violence. So that is good. The deteriorations, I spoke about Burkina Faso and Belarus. Azerbaijan, clearly linked with the conflict that flared up again last year. Armenia is just out of the top 5, but most of the combat and the, I would say, negative activity happened on the soil or territory of Azerbaijan. That's why they're in top 5. Zambia, a lot of troubles, border troubles with the DRC. And Honduras. Honduras has been there together with Nicaragua, really dropping fast, together with this region of the world. So when you look at the regions of the world dropping the fastest in peacefulness, you will always come back to Central America and South America. These two regions are dropping at the same level than the MENA region started to drop in the early 2010s. I'm not comparing the regions or not comparing the evolution of or what was going on in all those regions, but we see that the decrease in peacefulness is going at the same pace than the pace we noticed in the early 10s for the MENA region. We did some research on the impact of COVID-19 on peace, and there clearly we saw that some forms of violence like homicide, violent crime or homicides were a little bit lower during the first stages of the pandemic, so the first lockdowns. But by June, July last year, we came back to pre-COVID levels. So really a very temporary influence on some forms of violence, while we saw other forms like domestic violence, suicide, also lower levels of mental health kicking in at the same time. Now, civil unrest. So last year in the Global Peace Index, we identified this trend, or a 10-year trend, of an increase of the levels of civil unrest by 250%. Well, this year you can add another 10%, and this is clearly linked to COVID. Last year, we identified worldwide about 15,000 violent demonstrations, of which a third, about 5,000, were directly related to COVID. So COVID did not generate this civil unrest. It just accelerated and aggravated something that was already happening before. So the social economic grievances that led to this increase by 250% over the past decade is now being exacerbated by another, I would say, shock, the pandemic and also the economic downturn. So What we don't know is going to be the persistent effect. But what we think is that, and it's very difficult for some of the indicators to already understand what the impact would be, but we expect to be negative. And clearly, for some countries, if the poor economic conditions would persist, then the likelihood to have this continued trend, aggravated trend of civil unrest is definitely going to persist also, and maybe increase clearly. Political instability. So COVID-19 also had an impact on political instability, because a lot of opposition parties, and especially extreme parties like far left and right, but also international terrorist organization. And of course, I'm not comparing, I'm not making any correlation here, but basically the opposition used the response of our governments to COVID-19, criticized it, and of course used as a propaganda to say that they would have done a much better job if they would have to handle the crisis. So clearly this has fed into some forms of political instability through the civilian unrest, but also through the recuperation by opposing parties. So this is a distribution worldwide. So we clearly see some parts of Europe, Northern America, some parts of Southern America, and clearly India and Southern Africa that really saw large and quite violent demonstrations also. So the economic recovery will be the key factor to see whether or not civil unrest continues to grow. And so clearly we need to really adapt well to the economic situation of today, and try also to ease a little bit or diminish the socioeconomic impact of the crisis, to make sure that we can have a permanent positive impact also on the I would say, numbers of civil unrest and demonstrations. Clearly, we see that countries that were better prepared, better equipped, more resilient before COVID-19. So clearly, when you look at the levels of positive peace combined with some economic preconditions, well, those countries high there before the shock will recover much faster and will not be impacted so hard and for such a long time. That would be completely different for other countries. And examples like this, you have the positive examples on the slide, but those who were low on positive peace and low on the economic prerequisites before. So basically countries which did not really have a strong economy or very flexible, adaptable economy, countries like South Africa and Brazil, for example, well, they will be hit harder for a long time and will need much more help and I would say, time to recover from the economic downturn of COVID-19. So let's open the time window to a bit more than a decade now. There again, a decrease in peacefulness, 2%, mainly driven by conflict over the past decade. More countries that improved than those who deteriorated. And this slide is really showing you this different evolution when you improve and when you deteriorate, much higher when you deteriorate, and much faster also the deterioration. As I said, 9 deteriorations in the past 13 years and an overall decrease of about 2%. Mainly driven, so the past decade, mainly driven, higher impact of conflict, lower impact of militarization, and quite stable safety and security. And as you can see, in the past year and a half, changing trend in the 3 domains. So now we can say that the ongoing conflict, mainly driven by the MENA region, enters a new phase, lower number, lower intensity, lower number of casualties. But we see an increase in militarization and also a slight increase in safety and security. So clearly there we see less secure societies and a larger investment into the military. So last year, the largest increase in expenditure, US and China, clearly in competition. I think we enter a new phase in international relations that is now more based on competition. So automatically, you see largest investments in the militarization, which is one of the pillars of power. And the competition is basically comparing levels of power and comparing levels of influence. Germany and South Korea going through, I would say, more larger investments in modernization, of course, also development of their military, but definitely more modernization of their military, especially for South Korea, living in a geopolitical hotspot in the world. What we have seen over more than a decade now is this widening gap between the most and the least peaceful countries in the world. And even if we have this positive impact of this reduced numbers of conflict this year, the gap is still widening, and that is definitely worrisome. So now if we go into the details of some of the key indicators. So in the domain safety and security, as I already explained, higher number of violent demonstrations and also higher percentage of violence in potential demonstrations. Number of IDPs and refugees doubled over the past decade from 40 million to 84 million this year, which is a little plateau in the past year, but definitely over a decade doubled. And these numbers of IDPs and refugees sparked by natural disasters, conflict, and then also socio-economic conditions. A positive note, the homicide rate kept on falling over the past decade, so that is good. The battle death, as I said, lower numbers of conflicts, of battle death, and also lower intensity, or at least a positive effect on the intensity, which is good. When you look at the number of battle deaths, well, this graph is pretty comparable to the graph of the terrorism impact over the past decade. When we present the Global Terrorism Index, we always mention that 96% of all terrorist attacks occur in a conflict or in the conflict scenario. And so clear link there between this tactic and procedure that which terrorists can be within some more insurgency type conflicts throughout the world. Now, when it comes to militarization, there, the positive trend, change in trend the past year, armed force trade, military expenditure, but also import and export of weapons. So really something we need to keep an eye on. Every time we produce a global peace index and also other forms of research on peace and security, well, we always estimate the economic value of peace or the economic impact of violence. This year, a slight increase, 0.2%, but still close to $15 trillion spent last year on violence, which is about 11.6% of the total world GDP and pretty close to $2,000 for every person, also here on this webinar. So just imagine what you could do if you would reduce this by 1 or 10%. Basically, this 1%, so this 1.4 trillion or 1.5 trillion US dollars, that's the total global budget for overseas development aid. So if you would reduce the cost of violence by 1%, we could direct these financial assets into a lot of economic and development activities and actually double the budget for overseas development aid. While the economic impact of violence, so what we see, the figures I explained those to you, but we see some countries affected by conflict really spending a huge amount of money into violence. So Syria, it's at 81, or actually pretty close to 82% of the GDP spent on violence. South Sudan, 42, Afghanistan, 40%. And basically, a lot of countries within a conflict who are affected by some forms of violent extremism would spend on average of about 30 to 40% into violence. So those are economies, those are systems, those are societies who only have one priority, and that's combating violence, basically trying to create peace. There is no other priority possible in such systems. So you see that the 10 countries most affected average 36%, and the most peaceful countries only spend about 4% in countering violence. So what we need to do there is create more positive feedback loops and more, I would say, virtuous circles instead of these vicious circles bringing more violence and more investment in countering violence. That's the distribution of this budget. So about 75 to 80% goes to violence containment, about 43% in the military, 31% in internal security, so basically police or police-related forces, and a growing percentage also in PMSCs or private military and security companies. And for those who follow Africa a little bit closer, but they will know which impact those type of PMCs have in different African countries at the moment. Basically also promoting the influence of some global players. So clearly, I explained to you this new trend in larger numbers or larger investment in the military. I explained to you also that the domain internal safety and security is also decreasing or not really facing a negative impact. So you can imagine that these investments in these three in violence containment are only going to grow in the coming years. So only 20 to 25% are really directly related to some forms or the impact of some forms of violence, like homicide, suicide, violent crime, conflict, and other forms of violence. So clearly there large impact of the fear of violence and violence containment. Well, let's talk about the perception of risk or the perception of violence or the fear of violence. So this is, as I said, a collaboration with the Lloyds Foundation in London. Well, clearly, we see that 60% of the people globally are worried about sustaining serious harm from violent crime. So this is clearly impacting a lot of people in the world. We also see that in many countries, people don't really feel safe. And I will show you the more detailed figures afterwards. 75% of the people we interrogated did not really feel safer or less safe than 5 years ago. So this is good and bad news, or positive and negative news at the same time, because it did not decrease, but it definitely did not improve. So a lot of people do not feel safer than 5 years ago. And we also saw a small difference in the perception between genders. 5% more women were bothered about the impact of violence in their life. So this is a distribution worldwide. So clearly a concentration in Central and Southern America. And so those are part of the figures. And as I said, full report expected in September in collaboration with Lloyd's. So the example of Brazil is a very good example because you see about 83% of the people there that are worried about violence. But when you look at the figures for Brazil about their real experience of violence, so in the past 2 years, have you experienced violence, or do you know someone who experienced violence? Well, there the answers are going down lower than 40%, so lower than half the perception. So there is a clear difference in some countries between the perception of violence and the real impact of violence. What is really negative on this slide is the fact that on the figures for the experience of violence, top 5 countries are all sub-Saharan African countries, which is maybe not such a surprise when you look at, I would say, the research that we produce both in the peace indexes and also the global terrorism index. Same thing for those feelings about safety 5 years ago, but also the risk to violence. So you clearly see there also quite a large impact for some of the countries that people see the impact of violence or terrorism or some form of violence as the biggest threat to their integrity or to their lives. Number one is still the road-related or road traffic accidents, and health come third. But quite a lot of those data are still pre-COVID data. So we can imagine that health is getting is going to get more important and maybe climb to number 2 or number 1 position on this index. Well, that's the end of my presentation. We're looking forward to Andrew's presentation and definitely also to your questions in the Q&A. You can connect with us online, either on the website, as I said, all the resources available, and you can follow us on social media. And for those who want to know more about the Institute for Economics and Peace and the Global Peace Index and the evolution of the research, really starting from the idea of our founder and still today executive chairman Steve Killalay to what the IEP is today and to which resources we are producing. Well, Peace in the Age of Chaos is the book that he produced this year, and that I read it, and I'm even for myself working within the organization, I still learned a lot, and it really motivated me to read this, realizing that I'm working for a great institution. So thank you very much, and back to you, Enda.
Thanks, Serge. Thank you very much. And as I said, Serge, great to have you with us again. Folks, I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat box, and we'll take all those at the end as well, folks. So hold them for a few more minutes, and we'll combine the questions for Serge and Andrew and myself as we get on. So thank you, Serge, and over to Andrew.
Thank you, Enda. And thank you very much, Serge, for that excellent overview of the Global Peace Index and the state of peacefulness around the world. It is really fascinating, and there's quite a lot of shocking statistics in there, including, of course, that Syria spends over 40% of its GDP on military or on violence. You know, just generally speaking, I mean, one general reflection is that, you know, there exists a variety of indexes, from the Human Development Index and Human Happiness Index, also everyday peace indicators, amongst others out there. But I believe this is the only one that actually attempts to directly measure peace and peacefulness around the world, and certainly is the only sort of index that actually attempts to measure positive peace. And I think there's so many possibilities and opportunities with that, and that's one of the things that I wanted to speak about today. So, I mean, I think there's, you know, I could possibly comment on a million different topics or issues related to the Global Peace Index, as well as the concepts of negative and positive peace and their measurement into a neat global index. I mean, there's just so much going on here. So I'm going to try to limit myself to 2 very straightforward and basic comments that hopefully stimulate some discussion and or thoughts for our Q&A session. One of those is going to be about the possibility of the application of this type of peace index to monitoring post-conflict peacefulness, or to monitoring the progress and the development of peace over an extended period of time in post-conflict environments. And in particular, I want to talk about the possibility of a Northern Irish Peace Index. The other comment, or the second comment, is going to be around the measurement of positive peace. So my first comment, I guess, is directed primarily to the audience listening, and particularly those in Northern Ireland. And I'd like to suggest, or perhaps even press for a Northern Irish Peace Index, or at least outline some of the potential positives of having a Northern Irish Peace Index. So similar to the Global Peace Index that Serge just outlined, right? The IUP also collate much more thorough and more localized data to produce country level reports, such as a Mexico Peace Index and a Germany Peace Index. Now, these include sort of local level data and countrywide comparative perspective on negative and positive peacefulness within those countries. And I think they're very well done, much like this Global Peace Index, which we can sort of compare different countries, right? So I think that a Northern Irish Peace Index put together by the IEP could be a great tool for monitoring the progress of peace and the peace process in Northern Ireland. I think it could be a great complement to, or even perhaps even a source of information for other reports that monitor peacefulness in Northern Ireland, such as the Northern Ireland Peace Monitoring Report published by the Community Relations Council, as just one example of a few measures that are already in existence. In this way too, depending on how fine-grained that data is and whether at the local level, the council level, or perhaps the county level, a Northern Irish Peace Index might be useful to policymakers and practitioners, such as Enda and others, in various possible ways, from identifying specific issues to comparing different regions or locations, or tracking changes in the Northern Irish peace or peacefulness over time, right? And perhaps even comparing Northern Ireland to other places internationally. The IEP's measurement of negative peace, as we just saw within this Global Peace Index, relies on a lot of data which I think could be quite easily be attainable in Northern Ireland, and I think relatively easy for the IEP to put together in that respect. But in particular, I think I'd like to see a Northern Irish positive peace index. So Serge covered a tiny bit in the presentation about positive peace, and in particularly in relation to coronavirus or COVID-19 and how it's impacted levels of positive peace around the world. But since the IEP already has a positive peace framework used to measure positive peacefulness, the application of these models, I think, could be useful in some of the ways that I just outlined, specifically as another means to assess the progress of the Good Friday Agreement and peacefulness in Northern Ireland. I think it'd be basically, to put it in a different way, I think this could be an excellent tool for potentially monitoring the progress of peacefulness in various post-conflict societies around the world. So while, you know, obviously I'm talking specifically about Northern Ireland, the same could be said in terms of the application of these types of models, these types of frameworks for measuring peacefulness in various post-conflict societies around the world. However, having said all that, my second comment is about the measurement of positive peace. And I want to say something about that just precisely because I think it has such massive potential here. So the IEP already has a measurement of positive peace, and this focuses on the different pillars of positive peace identified by the IEP, and then a series of corresponding indicators for each of those pillars. And it's pretty straightforward. However, I do want to say that to a certain extent, the very notion of a peace index, or the very notion or idea of devising a set of objective, quantifiable criteria by which the advancement of the condition or norm of peace can be measured, is difficult and or perhaps problematic in some senses, particularly if used for understanding more localized processes, which of course would be the objective of a Northern Irish Peace Index or a localized peace index for another post-conflict society. And of course, some people argue that measuring peace in this way is essentially an impossible task. And I'm certain that there's many here in Northern Ireland that have had discussions over how to monitor the progress of peace, and probably centering on, you know, how to measure it, what to measure, and the reliability of available data. So adding to the difficulty there is, of course, capturing the changing context and understandings and norms across time and space, and particularly thinking about, you know, healing in a post-conflict society. How are we meant to capture the experiences and perspectives of people on the ground, and how they actually think about reconciling the past. Having said that, again, I do think that Northern Irish Peace Index could be really helpful to give us a sense of the levels of peacefulness over time in Northern Ireland, and perhaps provide the basis for a comparative perspective outside of this. And so in that light, I guess I'd like to end by perhaps asking a couple of questions in regards to both those comments that we could perhaps address in the Q&A session. I mean, I guess there's quite a few questions that I would like to ask, but I guess I'll ask a very straightforward one rather than a more difficult one about measuring positive peace. And that is just, a question to Serge, again, to answer in the Q&A if he has time, about how useful he thinks the positive peace frameworks and measurements can be as a tool to measure or monitor peacefulness in post-conflict societies, and in particular in a place like Northern Ireland. So I think that's it from me, and I look forward to the discussions that we can all have together after Enda kind of says a few more things and wraps things up. And so yeah, thank you very much for listening to me. Very brief comments, one about the usefulness of a positive peace index and its application in Northern Ireland, and the other about problems or the difficulties in measuring positive peace. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, Andrew. Brilliant. And I think it's lovely to go from Serge's international and touching on all of the different regions to bringing it home a little bit in terms of here, what we call home. And I think going forward, I mean, if you look at this year's results, for example, as many of you would have noticed, Ireland is now in the top 10 most peaceful countries in the world. Supplanted in Iceland, or sorry, supplanted in from 11 to 8. And with that in mind, looking at the UK, UK is now 33rd out of 163, which is its highest position since the peace index has actually began. So the natural question then is, going forward, when we actually zoom in on that, how useful would it be to look on a post-Brexit society, when we think about the conversations that our society is currently having about the Northern Ireland Protocol, about all the outworkings of Brexit and trade deals, looking at possibilities of border polls in the future, conversations around a new united Ireland, a federalistic Ireland, whatever that may be. What happens when those two data sets connect? What will that do to the UK? What will that do to the island of Ireland? And I think having a much more localized analysis of that going forward will be, I think, super helpful for a whole lot of reasons, both for communities working on the ground, for inward and outward investment, and for generally how we work with each other as individuals. And I think that's where our interest really comes in, and it has been for a few years with the IEP. And and I often hear Steve and Serge say this idea of, if you can't measure something, how can you really truly understand it? And there's a lot of great data out there. There's a lot of great people working from NISRA to the work from UU and INCORE and the Peace Index here. But how do we connect that in a wider way? And we had this chat last year in the webinar, and our kind of momentum with COVID obviously has taken us sideways. So we're hoping to open that conversation up with funders and things in the autumn and things as well. So with that in mind, and I recognize there's a few questions already around here, folks. I just want to use those comments just to tie the macro to the micro, but also to open the floor for the next 15, 20 minutes, just because normally in webinars, we kind of cut the Q&A quite short because there's so much content. There's tons of content from both Serge and Andrew there, but I think in the spirit of this, let's open it up and see where we get to with the conversation. And let's start with Andrew's first question actually to Serge there. So folks, either use the chat box or the Q&A feature. We can't promise we're going to get to them all, but we'll try and get to as many as we can over the next little while, all right? So Andrew, what was your question again to Serge, and let's take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, it was about the, as you said, the sort of the macro to the micro, as it were, and the application of the frameworks that go into the Global Peace Index, right? And their application to more localized contexts, and whether or not we can use I suppose the Global Peace Index frameworks and positive peace frameworks that the IEP has already developed as a tool to monitor the progress of and peacefulness in post-conflict societies, not just Northern Ireland, but in places around the world.
Great, thanks, Andrew.
Serge. Yeah, thank you. So first of all, when we look at positive peace, well, the definition that we give to the positive peace, and that's a systemic approach to peace. Those are the attitudes, the institutions, the structures that you need to put in place to create, develop, and maintain peace. And when you do so, you will see that, well, as I said, the levels of happiness and well-being will increase. You will increase also your ESG or your ranking or your scores on the ESG indicators, so economic, social, and governance, and definitely also increase your ecological resilience. So we use positive peace as a measure of development and a measure of resilience. As I said, systemic approach. What we also do, and basically positive peace originated, I would say, from the very beginning of the work of the Institute of Economics and Peace and the research. Because when you look at negative peace, when you look at the Global Peace Index, well, that's basically a snapshot of your levels of peacefulness, you know, after data completion at the end of December of the previous year, or for a lot of indicators also until the 30th of March of this year. Something we can change about it. That's just like a state of peacefulness in the world. Well, we have already, from the beginning, we asked ourselves, so what can a nation do? What can a community do to increase their levels of peacefulness? Where do they need to invest in? Well, those are those 8 pillars of positive peace. We have identified 3 indicators per pillar. So the positive peace report is based on 24 indicators. Well, how did we come to these 8 pillars and 24 indicators? We basically used the 80 to 100,000 data sets that we manage or we have access to at the Institute for Economics and Peace. And we filtered down, we distilled out of the process those who showed the largest impact on the creation of peace. But we still have much more than just those 24 indicators. So for a country, and we also at country level, at national level and subnational level, we can go into the detail of many more indicators than just those 24. We can really go up to 100, 150, 200 different indicators. And as you said, Enda, quantifying, measurable, also auditable, because all the sources and the data that we use are open and online. And this allows us to really identify the deeply rooted problems within a society, and also prioritize the actions that need to be taken to address those causes, address those problems, and create a positive change. So I think what is important for us, and that's what we have seen through the past 5 to 6 years when we started to use positive peace to also train and promote positive peace. Well, existing civil society initiatives, organizations, once they encompass their initiatives within this systemic approach that is linked to positive peace, well, see the results of their interventions strengthened. And really, the systemic approach allows you to understand that, the approach to positive peace is stronger than the approach to the individual pillars, or, you know, having a project that is not really triggering everything. So it's really systems thinking, nudging yourself or nudging your systems towards the objective that you set for yourself. And it's clearly also, as I said before, creating those positive feedback loops, making sure that your system is evolving in a positive direction. And I think when you see the returns on your investment, of course, you need to have a longer term vision, because you need to reach tipping points and get then greater impact and greater results. Well, when you see those results and when you see the systemic transformation, I guess it's worth the involvement. So how do we address communities? And I think that's the beauty of system thinking, because it's so flexible that you can explain it at national or even regional level, talk to multinational or multilateral organizations, and they are working with it, and they are working with the measurement, but they are also working with the incentives. But you can take it down really to the grassroots civil society organization, or within a village somewhere in Africa, trying to fight, or trying to address, I would say, some forms of violence or some form of instability over there. So that's the flexibility that is given to you by the systemic approach.
Brilliant. Thanks, Serge. 2 questions. First one's very specific, and the second one quite broad and really interesting, both of them. First one, probably, Serge, for yourself as well. Is there any data collected on weapons, arms manufacturing? You know, how has it changed over the years, and why is the metric maybe not included in the Peace Index?
So that's why, I mean, that's a very good question. That's especially why we are looking at weapons imports and exports. So those who export weapons, so those who produce and export weapons, are also, I would say, penalized when you look at this. And so when we look at the domain militarization, we clearly look at both aspects, those who produce and those who use. On the other hand, what we also do is we clearly look at the access to small arms and light weapons. So clearly there, within the domain safety and security, internal safety and security, we look at the legislation that is put in place and how easy or difficult it is to access small arms and light weapons within your society. And we definitely also look at the impact of the use of violence within conflict in the first domain, but also within society when we look at the levels of violent crime and when we look at the levels of homicide, for example, of which quite a lot are committed with firearms or arms. So we try to have to encompass as much as possible all the aspects of arms production, access to weapons, and also use of weapons and I would say the violence that is produced by using weapons. So there is not an indicator as such as on the production or the manufacturing of weapons, but we try to have a broader approach and really look at import, export, access, and impact when it's used.
Lovely, thanks, Serge. So the wider question and a fascinating one, and I think a really pertinent and important one, is how do we depoliticize data or data, right? And particularly, looking at COVID has shown us that, we see what we want to see. And I think that it's such a critical question, and I know so much that goes back to trust in society and trust in everything from our local government, our local government agencies, our National Statistics Agency, our press, fact checkers, all of that comes into the conversation. Never mind our own individual biases, you're right. So I think that's a hugely important question. So how do we make something that's published in a report, actually, how do we depoliticize that? And the fact, we've had this conversation even about our, potential funders for a Northern Irish Peace Report. Does it matter who funds it? Will that change the perception and how it lands? Will that, and then directly change the impact on the ground for people? Serge, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very fascinating, profound question. I think what we do at the Institute for Economics and Peace is, of course, be very consistent in the indicators that we use, the approach that we use, the way we build the different indexes. We are, of course, independent, so nobody is telling us what we need to do, or which research we should do, or what type of data set we should use. So the data that we use need to be, and that's why sometimes it is difficult to disaggregate, because you need to access data that is renewed every year, that is consistent, that is well collected, and so we work a lot with existing other reports based on only one indicator. For example, when we look at in positive peace, when we look at impact of corruption or levels of corruption, of course we are going to work with Transparency International. We look at what CIPRI is producing, what IISS is producing, and so within our methodology you will find in the index you will find per indicator what are the data sources that we use, mostly also driven by UN. When it comes to violent crime, of course we are going to collaborate on UNODC, and those are also the partners with whom we collaborate on a daily basis and also produce specific research for. So that's clearly what we try to do, bring it in an independent way, bringing in a way that is accessible to a large audience, but also to policy and decision makers, and as I said, within an academic world. Now, on the other end, to be completely honest and open, it is we are ranking nations of the world. We are ranking states in the world. So ranking is important for a lot of countries on the index. So clearly, I was really, as I said, that's why I mentioned it in my presentation, flabbergasted by the Icelandic reaction to say, yeah, we're number one, but we're not there. There's so much more to do. But you can be equally flabbergasted by countries not only believing you when they increase on your index, and then when sometimes they decrease for a clear reason, you're not reliable anymore. So this is really at the both sides. And then sometimes you get also difficult questions about why is China more peaceful, or on your index, why is China more peaceful than the United States, for example? And then, of course, you need to go into the detail of the indicators and realize that when you measure what we measure, it's difficult for the United States to have a high ranking or to improve on the ranking. The United States, for example, have a permanent decrease in positive peace over the past 10 years. So this is just more than the impact of one president, So we see longer term trends, and so this is a combat for us to be, not the combat, it's just like a permanent strive to be as relevant as possible and also as neutral and independent as possible by using the best available data also introducing within your index, within the trends of your index, revision of those data. That's what, for example, what we did with an index, or at least a data set provided with IISS on development of manufacturing of weapons and import-exports in the past year. So we reviewed the figures of last year and basically started this year with another ranking than we had last year because of this fresh data injected into the index. So yeah, that's what we try to do. Try to be as consistent as possible in our approach, and of course avoid to be exposed to the influence of some nations of the world. Yeah, clearly.
Great. Thanks, Serge. It's a big question, right? And probably one of the most important questions. And I think part of the answers as well for me is, the power of local partners. We kind of talked about that internally as well, of, how international organizations partner with local partners, how are those local partners perceived in terms of educational facilities such as our university, and then how does that connect to people on the ground, so thanks, Serge. Andrew, did you want to come in there as well?
Yeah, why not? I thought I might contribute to the discussion because I really enjoyed listening to Serge there and all the diverse examples of the politicization, as it were, of the IEP's reports and or findings across the world. And I thought those were fantastic and very fascinating examples of the ways in which different countries have reacted in different ways to the results of the IEP. But I just thought, because it is a very profound question, I was thinking actually maybe we might think about depoliticizing data at two different levels. One level, what goes into the data, and then also depoliticizing what goes out of the data. And so basically what I was thinking there with that was that the best way probably to depoliticize data is depoliticizing essentially what goes in, right? And that means having very, very good, very clear and very well designed indicators that measure something, whatever it is that you're measuring in that particular instance, right? So,
exactly.
And making sure that those are objectively and consistently applied across the board. So that's one way in which that data itself, right, you can depoliticize the data itself. Then, of course, it's about what comes out, right? And there's no clear answers, as Serge sort of said or outlined there, in terms of once you have something, once you have the data, once you have and you collate it and you analyze it and you have a certain set of findings, there's no way telling about how people might interpret those findings or how people might take those and use them for their own political purposes or whatever, as Serge just outlined. But I think the better your information is going in terms of the better and the more reliable the data is that you use, then the less likely or the fewer opportunities there are for people to interpret in different ways what's coming out of that data. That's how I would think about it anyway.
And I think, Enda, it's also important to realize that what we do is we measure, we quantify, and of course we try to analyze, understand why there are some changes in trends and some variation, but we do not assess if it's good or bad for the countries that are on our index. So it's not, I mean, we do not assess, we don't have an assessment on good or bad and for us, it cannot be a competition. You cannot compete to become more peaceful. It's just an objective that all the countries on the index need to have. And so, yeah, so I think you're absolutely right, Andrew. That's what I tried to explain, but you concised it in a few sentences. You depoliticize, the data that you use by being very consistent and using really high quality and reliable data sets and data collection. And then afterwards, the reactions are completely different. I mean, just to give you maybe one more example, Enda, we at some point, National Security Council from an Asian country visited me here in Brussels. And they wanted to show me a PowerPoint. So yeah, let's go. And so what they showed me is the draft of the new national security policy. And basically they took all the indicators of negative peace and they say, well, we drafted this new national security policy according to the indicators because we want to score very high, which was fascinating. And of course, I explained to them that they need to change the indicators and take the positive peace indicators to influence their levels, or definitely. But you know, the effort was made to look at the way in which you measure peace, so you measure peace and you quantify peace and try to adapt your security policy to make sure that you can become more peaceful. And I think that's what if you want to do something, if you want to influence policymakers, well, it's political. Well, we want to influence them for the better. and really develop policies that are creating more peaceful societies.
Brilliant. That's a nice way to bring us in, Serge. And just to pick up on Theodora's point there as well, how, when we look at this macro, when we look at the data on a page, how does that connect to things like mental health, right? And how do we look at the correlations between data to make our public agencies make better decisions? And I think that's a nice way to connect it, because then how does the data have a real input on people's real lives at both the local level and the international level? So brilliant point as well in the middle of that. Serge, thank you again. Absolutely brilliant to have you. Andrew, fantastic to have you as well. Again, it's lovely to continue this relationship between the Mitchell Institute, the Clinton Institute, and the Institute for Economics and Peace. And folks, for everyone who's here from Belfast and Ballynahinch to Bangkok to Brisbane, if you want to know more information, check out visionforhumanity.org and ourselves at leadershipinstitute.co.uk, obviously with the Mitchell Institute as well, folks. And listen, finally, a huge thanks to Sue and Rachel from Leadership Institute, who helped make this happen today, with Maria from the IEP as well. Without them, this wouldn't have happened. For everyone else, folks, it'll be up on YouTube. For anyone who is watching this on YouTube, thanks very much, and look after yourselves, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Enda, and thank you, Serge. Good to see you both.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you, folks. That's us pretty much bang on the hour as well. Lovely. Thanks, folks.
And thank you for everybody at the IEP for putting this together. And thank you, everybody who's attended the session. It's awesome. It's great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, folks.